While out celebrating their associate Cherry's retirement, Matt Murdock, Foggy Nelson, and Karen Page are ambushed by Benjamin Dex Poindexter. And if you thought that was going to make for a perfectly innocent opening action sequence, you should know that Foggy is actually killed during this attack. Yeah, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't started Daredevil Born Again just yet, but a main character from the original Netflix series is immediately killed off in the very first scene, and I do have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, I like Murdock's friendship with Foggy, so not being able to enjoy Foggy's proper introduction into the MCU feels really disappointing. On the other hand, Foggy's death also makes for an incredibly unexpected yet totally exciting, inciting incident. It immediately establishes the stakes of the new show, while also acting as the catalyst that moves the plot forward. So while I personally would have liked to see more of Foggy Nelson in this show, I think his immediate death does act as a bold, creative choice, narratively speaking. Plus, when Daredevil Born Again was originally being developed, I remember hearing that Foggy Nelson and Karen Page were not going to be part of this series. That is, until Marvel changed direction midway into production and hired David Scartapane to become the new showrunner. So Scartapane retroactively wrote Foggy and Karen back into the series, but he already had a lot of footage that didn't have either of their characters in it. Which means that killing Foggy and having Karen move to San Francisco in the very first episode also acts as a creative way to explain why both of their characters are absent from this narrative. So, while the first 10 minutes can come across as rather divisive to hardcore fans of the original Netflix series, I do understand why Scartapane chose to open the show this way. Foggy's death isn't meant to provide simple and meaningless shock value. It's meant to propel the story forward in a way that also allowed Scartapane to elevate the material that was given to him. So I personally think that it works. And besides, this is the MCU we're talking about here. The only person who has ever stayed dead is Aaron Taylor Johnson's version of Quicksilver. So, despite how concrete things may appear to be for Foggy's character right now, I'm not entirely convinced that we won't somehow see Foggy reappear sometime in the future. At any rate, Foggy's death causes an enraged Murdock to drop Dex off of a roof, where Cherry discovers his identity as Daredevil. But that doesn't seem to have any consequences, because a year passes by, and Murdock is now partnered with former District Attorney Kirsten McDuffie, having officially retired his Daredevil alter ego. We then learn that Poindexter has been given a life sentence for his crimes, and while I don't know how the fuck he could have survived being thrown off of a building, I'm glad that we will be seeing more of his character in the future. Kirsten then sets Matt up on a date with her therapist friend Heather Glenn, and the two do actually manage to hit it off. Which is nice, because Murdock definitely deserves to be in a happy relationship, but I can't help but to wonder about his relationship with She-Hulk. I mean, the last time we saw them together, they did appear to be happy with each other. So, what happened to them? I know they happen to live in different states, and that a lot can definitely happen within an entire year, but I wish their relationship was at least acknowledged here, especially since Charlie Cox has openly admitted that he would love to have Tatiana Maslany appear in this show. Regardless, Wilson Fisk decides to run for mayor of New York City on an anti-vigilante campaign, and he wins the election by the time the first episode is over. Which means that the first episode does span an unusually lengthy amount of time, but I personally didn't mind the ambiguity. And I also didn't mind how surprisingly political the show became, because while the real-world political parallels were about as subtle as a sledgehammer, I'm glad that the show wasn't afraid to say something, especially considering how empty Captain America Brave New World felt by comparison, since that movie seemed too afraid to say anything about anything. And of course, much like the Netflix series before it, Daredevil Born Again is at its best when it focuses on the relationship between Matt Murdock and Wilson Fisk, which is why the best scene in the first two episodes involves a simple conversation between these two characters. This is where we learn that Fisk had nothing to do with Foggy's murder, allegedly, and that he has kept his promise to not hurt any of Murdock's friends. But when Murdock warns Fisk that he will retaliate if he steps out of line, Fisk counters that there will be consequences if Murdock resumes his activities as Daredevil. And I absolutely loved the tension that is built in this one meeting, because it shows that despite his faith in the justice system, Matt is going to have a tough time trying to do what he feels is the right thing to do. Speaking of which, Matt decides to represent a man named Hector Ayala, who is accused of assaulting and killing an undercover cop. In reality, Hector tried to stop two aggressors from beating up a seemingly innocent man, unaware that the pair were actually police officers. However, Matt finds out that Hector is a vigilante known as White Tiger, and that he became a vigilante after Daredevil's disappearance. Now, I don't know anything about White Tiger as a comic book character, so his development in this show is going to be completely new to me, but I'm glad that Daredevil is going to be involved with more comic book heroes, and it'll be interesting to see how smaller characters like White Tiger will connect to the larger MCU, if at all. I do think it's hilarious that White Tiger needs a mystical amulet of some kind, though, because that concept does seem to be in stark contrast with how grounded and down-to-earth the rest of the series is. But I guess that is to be expected, since Daredevil does exist as part of a large universe like the MCU. And I like when the more interconnected elements are actually addressed instead of just ignored completely. At any rate, Fisk learns from Ben Urich's young journalist niece Bibi that the NYPD commissioner is poised to resign in protest of Fisk's criminal past. To counter this, Fisk threatens to expose the commissioner's infidelity and blackmails him back into office. So, despite whatever optics idea Fisk may try to come up with in order to look good for the greater public, I'm glad that deep down he's still the same old kingpin that we know and love. Vicious, violent, and evil to the core. That will never change even if he has to go to couples therapy. And some people may not buy into the idea of Fisk going to therapy to begin with, but I believe this version of the character does actually love his wife, and that he would do anything aside from letting go of his evil ways, of course, in order to not lose her. So I don't mind it, especially since the therapist that Fisk and Vanessa are seeing is none other than the therapist that Murdock happens to be dating. So that should make for some interesting developments, especially since Matt had to unleash the devil on some corrupt police officers who were going to kill him and the key witness in Hector Elias' murder trial. And That's how the episodes end, with a violent action sequence that reminds us that Daredevil will have to be forced out of retirement, even if he has to face dire consequences for it. So I have to admit that I really liked these 2 episodes. They may not have been as dirty or as gritty as any of the original episodes on Netflix were, but they still acted as a solid reintroduction into this world in general. And that is an impressive feat to accomplish, given how this show basically had to balance being a brand new MCU series while also being a continuation of an entirely different show. But I think Born Again did manage to find a happy middle ground, since it did tell a captivating story in its own right, while still capturing the same kind of vibe and spirit of the original series. At least, the first 2 episodes did, in my opinion. We'll see how the rest of the series will turn out to be, especially as the show spends more time developing its new characters and spends less time focusing on characters that we already know and love. R.I.P. Foggy. Still, I do want to see more of this particular story, so I'm definitely looking forward to seeing more episodes of this show. Hopefully the fight scenes will improve by incorporating a little less CGI, and hopefully we'll get a surprising MCU cameo instead of just a simple Spider-Man shoutout, but I guess we'll see what'll happen on the next episode of Daredevil Born Again once it gets released on Tuesday.